Hello everybody and welcome to our inaugural webinar for 2019. We're so happy to be back with you. Sorry for the technical difficulties and the delayed start time this afternoon. Before I do get into the webinar, I do want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land which we're situated on at the moment, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we'd like to pay respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging. Today's webinar, as I said, is the very first for 2019 in a series of 10 what we call Connect and Learn webinars. They're designed to support AOD clinicians throughout regional and metropolitan Victoria, hosted by us, Turning Point, and these are funded by the Department of Health and Human Services here in Victoria. My name is Sheridan and I'm going to be the facilitator for today's webinar. So we're very excited to have Jeff Bailden from YSAS back with us. Jeff actually delivered a webinar for us last year which was really popular. It was called The Role of Risk in Adolescent Development, Young People and Drug Use. And this webinar provided participants with an opportunity to kind of understand the role of risk in young people's lives and also drug use. And for many people who are very passionate about working with young people across Victoria, we got messages to say that that was really, really important work for them. So, and there were many people who are asking questions. So Jeff has kindly come back and to continue on the topic about risk in adolescence and particularly drug use. So we're very, very grateful that he spent the time today with us to do that. So just before we get into that though, just a reminder that these webinars go for around 45 minutes and people tell us that they get the most out of them when they are really interactive with them. So you'll see a chat box that is down the bottom, where is it, the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Feel free to make comments or ask questions at any point along the way. There's also going to be a poll, so if you can, just participate as much as you can. Get involved in answering the poll. We know that people get the most out of it when they participate. So my role today is about collecting your comments and questions, and there'll be a designated time to put those questions to Jeff and he'll answer as many as possible. If you're watching this webinar as a replay, Jeff has kindly given his email as well, so you could always consider sending your question to him directly. There's also some PDFs in a folder that's down the right-hand corner of your screen. Now we've also got a PDF version of these PowerPoint slides there for you, and Jeff has gave us the link to two research papers. So we've put those two research papers in that folder for you as well. So you can go ahead and download those whenever you like. If you have technical problems today, Redback is here to help you out, and their phone number is also on the bottom of your screen, so you could contact them. So I wanted to introduce Jeff Bailden from YSAS. He is your presenter today, and he's an experienced youth worker and is a senior trainer and practice consultant. He's actually worked with YSAS for over 15 years now across many programs, including outreach, day programs, drug withdrawal units, and long-term residential rehabilitation, and he was contracted to deliver training all over Victoria to educate on methamphetamine use, and as I said, his specialisation is in young people. So I wanted to pass over to Jeff now and thank him very much. I think this is just going to be a really, really interesting webinar.
Cool, thank you, Sheridan. Cool beans. So let's have a bit of a chat about risk today. So I guess I wanted to, from the outset, acknowledge that working with risk is incredibly challenging and incredibly anxiety-provoking and incredibly difficult work. And my background, as well as sort of youth AOD stuff, is in venture-based therapy, so I'm a big fan of risk, very risk positive, love a good bit of risk taking, but I understand it's not everyone's cup of tea, and people have more or less comfort with risk in general. So, and working with young people who are taking risks and are highly vulnerable and getting into all sorts of conundrums is incredibly difficult. So I don't want to minimise or downplay that at all. But what we're going to be talking about today is understanding and framing risk in a useful way that's congruent with what we know about adolescence, and using the understanding or the what young people are communicating through their risk taking to inform care planning and to inform what we can do to support them and meet their needs as effectively as possible. So by way of sort of a stepping off point, look at what risk is. We talked about this a lot in the previous webinar, but I guess there's a lot of different ways of understanding risk. But the idea of risk is the consequence and a probability of a hazardous event or phenomenon. Is sort of the stock standard understanding of risk. But we want to sort of move away from those OH&S type paradigms of risk, sort of spinning thresher wheel that needs a guard on it type risks, or the manhole cover that needs some yellow and black tape around it, and look more at sort of business paradigms of risk. That young people are not, when they're taking risks, it's less about them sort of blindly bumbling around the countryside and falling in holes and sort of hurting themselves on things, and much more a considered process where they're looking to essentially gamble for a preferred outcome for some sort of reward. And I think it's really important to understand that the dimension of reward is absent from the OH&S paradigm of risk, and very much part of what we understand the business paradigm. And risk, that sort of reframing of risk as opportunity. So today we're going to be talking about adolescent risk-taking. And adolescent risk-taking, there's a lot of myths and misnomers and furphies and unhelpful understandings around adolescent risk-taking that we sort of want to move away from to be able to have a better understanding and ideally provide better support. So essentially, there's two types of adolescent risk-taking. We have novelty and sensation-seeking, which is a common trait for all adolescents and really, really useful and developmentally appropriate. The thing about sensation-seeking and novelty-seeking is that it's essentially a biological mammalian drive that pushes the adolescent to learn and to grow and to develop and try new things, to explore its environment. And some people are more or less sort of sensation-seeking. I know myself, again, background in adventure-based therapy, I love a bit of novelty and sensation-seeking. Still, as a somewhat fully formed adult, still a big fan of risk and sensation-seeking. And when it's done, when sensation-seeking, young people pursue new activities, they pursue them with their sort of limbic arousal system connected to their cortical areas, to the prefrontal cortex, to the learning processes of their brains. So novelty and sensation-seeking risk-taking is absolutely a learning endeavour. So it's something that, whilst young people who are novelty-seeking or potentially more heightened than novelty-seeking and sensation-seeking might take more risks, they learn from those risks, and especially around things like drug and alcohol use. There's some adolescents who are really keen on sensation-seeking who will potentially more likely experiment with drug and alcohol use. But once the negative effects kick in, once the side effect, some downsides, some dramas and problems start to occur with that, because it's an integrated cognitive process of risk-taking, the learnings, people reflect and they learn and they moderate their behaviour, change their behaviour in response to those negative effects. So they tend to not continue into problematic adult drug and alcohol use. Again, learning from the negative effects of that risk-taking. We also have impulsive risk-takers, and at YSAS we work with a lot of young people who, impulse control, emotional regulation, distress tolerance, some of these cognitive skills aren't so well developed, and I'm sure a lot of you out there in webinar land are working with young people who have much heightened impulsivity. So when we're talking about impulsivity, we're talking about there's two types of sort of well-described impulsivity in the literature. We're talking about acting without thinking, or motor impulsivity, and impulsive choice. So impulsive choice is one of those sort of things that probably best described as choosing smaller rewards, choosing like, I want the immediate thing now, I want the exciting thing, I want the shiny thing right now. I will, happily take a small shiny thing now compared to waiting for longer for a bigger, more exciting reward. And impulsive choice decays over the lifespan. So young people have worse impulsive choice than adolescents, who have worse impulsive choice than adults. So it's one of those things that, as an impulsivity does get better over the lifespan. On the other hand, acting without thinking, or motor impulsivity, is a reasonably consistent characteristic or trait, which does have a bit of a blip of heightened activation in adolescence. So if you typically are impulsive and act without thinking, as a young person, as a child, that trait's likely to continue into adolescence and into adulthood. So behaviours, go on and smoking bongs with your friends, even though it's a school night, taking risks around a variety of different things. When it is an impulse, this seems like an awesome idea, I'm going to get involved in it right now. That sort of impulsivity is a constant. And what we'll be talking about in terms of care planning is that there's two bits of work we need to be doing with young people. One is working on impulsivity, working on building skills to reduce the impact of that impulsive acting without thinking type choice, and also looking at, for those young people who, well, all young people, but the young people who are engaging in sensation seeking and risk taking, that is a learning endeavour, providing safe and more meaningful avenues for them to do that, and also looking at what they're trying to get out of those risks, what they're trying to get out of that gamble. Cool. So we've got a quick poll just to get people thinking and chatting. So, sorry. How do we do the poll thing, Sharon? Is it?
We might just pause for a sec. Somebody's just saying that they don't have any sound. Yeah, we're going to do that. So we actually do. Yep. So there's the poll now.
Awesome. So if you just click a box, which one of these you think is the most damaging type of risk that young people are exposed to? Really keen to hear what people think about this. Cool. I've never seen this live before. This is really interesting. And again, please, if anyone's got any questions, this is a fair bit of information in a short period of time. So if you want me to clarify anything, if I'm going too quickly or glossing over things, please let me know. We'll give it a couple more seconds before we close the poll, Sharon. Yeah.
I think that's a great idea.
Yep.
I just got somebody saying they can't hear as well, so I might just check in with Rebecca if you can. Yeah, so you're onto it. All right, so if anybody can't hear, some people are saying they don't have sound. So we'll just wait another few seconds while Rebecca work on that as well. But yeah, that's really interesting actually, Jeff, that people have jumped right in and started to answer that poll. It's really interesting results.
Just while people are completing the poll, just to clarify on that, the acting without thinking impulsivity domain, that one of the theories around why that increases somewhat in adolescence and then goes back to the normal level afterwards is around heightened dopaminergic activation in the reward pathway, as in there's more shiny things, I guess, in adolescence, if that makes sense to people. Alrighty. You tell me when you want to.
I think, yeah, we could probably stop the poll now. That's. Yep. I think everyone's had a bit of a go. That looks good.
Awesome. So,
most people were saying cultural, weren't they? I think they're the biggest.
So is the poll? So it looked like there was some ticks for reputational, some votes for physical and emotional. One of the I guess this is one of those questions designed to draw out a bit of thinking that essentially there's not one type of risk that is more damaging than the other. They've all got dimensions of impact, and I think I noticed a lot of people were picking emotional risk. Knowing that adolescence is a time of heightened plasticity, that people absorb more, that there's more changes going on in the brain, that people are more sort of impacted by their environments and by their experience, that people experiencing more sort of adverse emotional outcomes, rejection, bullying, those sort of potential, negative outcomes of emotional outcomes can have a massive impact on mental health, on suicidality, on self-injury. I think that's great to see people thinking on those domains. Physical is sort of a given, isn't it, when we think about physical risk, broken arms, car crashes, those sort of things, bloodborne virus transmission. And reputational, I noticed in there was quite a few people were sort of flagged that up as a damaging type of risk. And an example that comes to mind is a client I worked with in Frankston many moons ago who had behaviour change. For him, basically, there was he had a reputation as a dangerous, scary, vicious person in Frankston, and every now and again he'd do something really extremely aggressive and violent, and people go, "Oh, that's right, Dave's just a nut. Dave's a crazy person. Don't mess with Dave. Don't ever, cross Dave because he's out there. He's crazy. He's vicious." So he had a reputation that if he was to change his behaviour, if he was to do something different, if he was to go back to school, for example, if he was to engage in drug treatment meaningfully, all of these things would erode that reputation, and he would be in fairly grave danger. That's a fairly big risk to his survival. That once people weren't scared of him anymore, they thought maybe he's a lovely, wonderful, kind-hearted chap that he doesn't have any real backup in the world, and he would have to probably deal with the consequences of some of his prior behaviour. So thinking about that sort of the risk to people's reputation, about behaviour change, and about engaging in a lot of other activities. The other thing in there I think that's important is to note that risk, or our perception of risk taking, our understanding of risk, is quite gendered. That there's the idea of sort of more traditionally sort of female risks, more sort of internalised risks like the emotional, reputational type risks, don't tend to get as much attention, don't tend to get as much focus as the physical risks, stolen cars, young people doing dangerous physical things. It tends to be more of a male domain. So it's important that we're aware of the risks and harms that can come to young women as well. And I think cultural risk as well, thinking about how people might be impacted, how people's connection to their culture and to their family, the belief systems and values and views of their family of origin and their culture of origin can be impacted by certain behaviours that they engage in or don't engage in. That's a real genuine risk to young people. Cool. All right, where's my little... Yes. Thank you. Awesome. So, risk is learning and development. There are some risks, absolutely, like suicidality, which is just something we need to manage and avoid and shut down as best as possible, something that we genuinely do need to treat as a hazard. But for most young people, risk-taking is a gamble. It's a process of trying to understand what they can, trying to get something, trying to gain something. There's a lot of literature discusses young people being hyper-rational. So there's some stuff by Roma and some stuff by Siegel where they discuss young people's hyper-rationality. Part of this, what they mean by hyper-rational, is that young people make decisions that will preference reward or gaining or developing new things or new skills and expanding over sort of being quite risk averse like adults, which adults make decisions more sort of heuristically, more gist based, more based on the vibe of the thing, whereas adolescents will actually weigh up cognitively the risk and reward. And if you think about adolescence, when I sort of think about adolescence, I sort of like to think of this sort of entrepreneurial type model, like young people as little entrepreneurs, as little startups. So in a startup, in the early days of a business, you're focusing on expanding, developing, growing, taking risks. I like the idea of if young people are a startup, if young people are sort of junior entrepreneurs who are out there trying to build this business, trying to grow, trying to develop these sort of skills and abilities and get these resources, that our role as workers is as like an incubator. They have those startup incubator things where all of the cool kids go and hang out and they have their shared workspaces. That's us. Our role is there to try and nurture and provide opportunities for growth and development. Whereas obviously adults, it's about consolidating and stabilising. You've learnt the skills, developed the resources, and you are sort of stable and consistent in your adult life. Click, I think, yeah.
Sorry. I'll move that one along. There you go.
So when we're thinking about about domains of risk, like you're sort of engaged with in the survey, there are lots of different ways, lots of different domains of risk, and some really don't get taken into consideration. And this is just a sort of a quick list of some of the things we need to be considering. And some of the risks, I think it's really important in this space to think about some of the risks we ask young people to take that we don't assess for and don't consider, and some of the risks that we panic about and agonise over, which really aren't that big of a concern. I mean, some of the physical risks, I've had lots of conversations with statutory workers about the potential of a young person maybe breaking an arm or a leg. That's a pretty minor risk, really, when you think about, I don't know if anyone out there in webinar land remembers breaking their leg or arm in year 8 and you get a cast and all your friends sign it and you pull for a few weeks. Not really an ongoing, enduring, damaging proposition, but some of the, if we're asking young people to take the risk of trying out detox, for example, this is something that amongst their peer group they might experience rejection and isolation because you think you're better than us, Robbo, you're going to detox, you think you're going to sort your life out, that sort of stuff that people going back to school and whether they have a strong beliefs or schemas about their sort of lack of self-worth or their inability to achieve that, we might be setting up activities that can really compound and damage that, which quite often we don't think about. We think, school's wonderful, school's great. So remembering to think about all these different directions and domains and different sort of angles on risk, that it's not just broken arms and legs, and as it's lovely to see everyone realising, and being aware of how big of an impact emotional risk-taking and reputational risk-taking risk dimensions have. So quick sort of reminder of acuity of risk. The reason I sort of put this slide up around acuity is because acuity gives a sort of value or a quality to those different risks. So there's some risks that might be an acute, possibly, you could definitely do some, for example, someone being bullied at school, someone being sort of socially isolated might have, the acute risk of possibly connecting to self-injury or some suicidal ideation, but also thinking about what some of those other risks, the cumulative impact of legal risk-taking. So thinking about someone who has these sort of negative adverse outcomes in the legal realm, that the more time you accumulate more charges over time, so the subsequent charges are going to be greater and more severe, that person has increased connection to the criminal justice system, so potentially cumulative risk around developing a more criminogenic identity and attitudes and associations with other peers. So I think that's, whilst again, this is I'm sure for all of you out there in webinar land, similar to us at YSAS, a lot of the work we do is putting out fires and triage and responding to crisis, but where we can, being able to try and take that step back and thinking about these other dimensions of risk other than the acute. Cool. So we get into some of the drivers of risk, some of the reasons why people might take risks. What are the things that cause adolescents to take risk? I mentioned earlier some of that limbic activation, heightened dopaminergic activity in the reward pathways of the brain, which makes absolute sense for mammals who are have to leave the nest, go out there and deal with scary, difficult, challenging, novel experiences, to explore new environments. Makes a heap of sense to get people the heck out of the nest. So that's the neurobiological sort of underpinnings, but there's also a whole bunch of tasks or sort of psychological processes that adolescents need to go through in order to, I guess, be well prepared for adult life. On this slide, you can see a bunch of things that adolescents typically don't have, or children don't have. Adolescence is the process of gaining these, of getting these, of achieving and getting hold of these sort of things. So, achieving identity, achieving independence from parents and other adults. So individuation is a really important task of adolescence. Individuation sort of classically is done in opposition. So whatever the status quo does, whatever the parents do, whatever your sort of family of origin does, you do the opposite so that you can stand out, so that you can show the world that you are different to them, that you are not part of that identity, you have your own identity. There might be some of you out there that remember some of the things you might have done as an adolescent to individuate and to separate and to show that you were different and unique. And obviously within that, doing things that are the opposite to the status quo, that's going to drive a lot of risk-taking. So whether it's crime, whether it's graffiti, whether it's antisocial type behaviours, They're things that can make us stand out, make us seem very different from our family of origin, but they're also inherently risky. Developing a realistic, stable, positive self-identity. So identity formation is a key element of adolescent development. So when we're trying on different hats, when we're trying on different identities, different masks, figuring out who we are and what we're about, there's all of that stuff is novel, it's new, we're not good at it yet, we don't have skills in it yet, we're learning this stuff. And essentially understanding that risk is something that, like, if you're good at something, if you have skills in it, if you've been doing it for 20, 30 years, you know, like look at arborists, look at people who work on oil rigs, once you get really good at something, the risk drops dramatically. But for adolescents, they are not good at this stuff. This is all brand spanking new. They have a whole bunch of tasks and roles and things they need to do and develop and grow that they have no freaking idea how to do. And when you don't have a frame of reference, when you don't have experience, all of these things are inherently going to be very dangerous and fraught with risk. But you know, as fully functioning adults out there in webinar land, I'm sure that all of these things you've progressed through these, you've gained these skills and abilities and resources, and they're not fraught with the danger they were when you first tried them. I guess the other thing that's worth thinking about here in terms of drivers, or why young people engage in the gamble of risk in adolescence, is schemas and beliefs and worldview, which I think we don't have time to get into that in too much detail, but I think the way young people, these sort of unconscious working models people hold of about themselves and the way that the world works, can have a big impact on the things that they want to, that sort of the drivers of risk taking, some of the behaviours they want to engage in, and also how they might value those perceived outcomes and the possible things they're going to put on the line, what they're willing to gamble. So I keep clicking the button, not the mouse. There we go. So the gamble of risk. This idea of the gamble, I think, is really key, because this, from that sort of business paradigm I mentioned before, the entrepreneur, essentially you are trying to grow the business. You're trying to set yourself up for for adult life. You're trying to make sure that your business is scalable and it has all the things it needs to be able to take on the world. So this, essentially young people are in a position where there's a bunch of things that we just mentioned that they're going to need to try and achieve, try and get. But this is not without risk. So these things that they want to try and achieve, trying to get to grow the business, as it were, these things, these sort of outcomes, the importance of these outcomes are determined by a bunch of different factors. So again, to add a value or a context to those items. So thinking about stuff like connecting to peers. What's the social context of that? Do you have lots of other peers? Do you have lots of opportunities for that? Do you have no other peers? So depending on your keenness to to connect with people and engage with peer groups and grow your sort of your social identity, then if you have very little opportunity for that, then anything that comes up that might provide that as a resource is going to be much more valuable. I hope that makes sense to people. So mood and mental health is going to have an impact. Age and stage, so when someone's where someone's at when they're 12 as opposed to 22 is going to have a very different, a very distinct impact on the value of these outcomes people are gambling for. And again, some of the secondary gains, some of the other additional things that you might get from this risk-taking behaviour. So we've talked about what you might want to get, so some of the things you're trying to achieve. So what's on the line if you spin the wheel of risk? And as I mentioned, adolescents are really, like entrepreneurs, really keen to spin that wheel, to try and see what they can get out of risk, try and see what they can. They're much more attuned to the benefits and rewards than they are to potential downsides or deficits. This makes a fair bit of sense when you think about what, for adults, I'm sure people out there have heard of the idea of loss aversion. Adults have a really strong sense of loss aversion. Adults do not deal well with possibly losing things that they have. This makes a lot of sense because you're consolidating. But for adolescents, you don't really have much. So it's all really about gaining, attaining, growing, developing. There's not a whole bunch on the line to be sort of be lost, I guess. When you don't have much in the bank, going bankrupt isn't so much of a concern, if that makes sense. So the importance or value of the things people put on the line. Again, schemas, beliefs about themselves and the world are really important. So how you see yourself, how you see you know, some of these assets and things that you're willing to risk or gamble with is really key. I'll get to that in the next slide. Family and social beliefs and norms. So what is the sort of background you're coming from? What do people, you know, I guess, how do people, your culture, your family, your community value these things? And there's a whole bunch of things about known versus ambiguous risk. Whether you know what the outcome is, it's a 40%, 20%, 50% likelihood of outcome versus this looks like a pretty awesome reward, but we got no idea whether you'll lose big or small or lose it all. So adults are pretty rubbish at ambiguous risk when there's a chance that you know, you could lose, when there's an unknown risk or ambiguous risk, you don't know the odds. Adults are really, really reluctant to gamble, but adolescents, when there's ambiguous risk, are pretty keen to roll the dice. Adolescents sit much more effectively with ambiguous risk. And again, thinking about that paradigm or the idea of the entrepreneur or the startup company, that's where you need to be. That's, you know, Apple, when they were, you know, making the iPhone, that would have been a pretty massive risk. You know, to make a computer phone that has a camera and a GPS. What? That's a crazy, silly idea. Why would you do that? It's going to cost us billions of dollars. That's a massive risk. And unless you're very risk positive, unless you're going, well, there's a massive payoff if this works out for us, in that sort of entrepreneurial spirit, then you don't achieve the market dominance that Apple has today. So again, I think there's a lot to be sort of borrowed from that framing of risk and growth through sort of business models. So understanding the gamble. Talk a little bit about a client or a sort of case study. So thinking about a young person who's 15, trying ice with some new friends, despite hearing many negative things about it. There is a lot of messaging out there about the downsides of methamphetamine. So this young person is about to make a gamble, about to take, you know, to take a risk here. So when we're thinking about how that gamble works, we got to think about the potential outcome. So this young person, and again, young people aren't stupid or mindless. You know, impulsivity is part of this equation as well. But young people are pretty considered in this. So for this young person, the potential outcome makes me feel like a boss. Well, my mate said that meth makes you feel like you are a king, makes you feel like you're an, you know, like absolutely, you know, power, control, agency, most switched on. And yeah, that sounds pretty good. It's also a connection to a new social group. So these are some people who membership of this group, membership of this you know, this little clique is around drug use. It also provides a powerful gangster identity. You know, smoke shard, bruts. I'm gangster. You know, I am you know, I am edgy. I am, you know, I am out there. I'm doing this. You know, this again. We're looking at sort of individuation. There's a whole bunch of stuff in here about, you know, normal adolescent processes, but those sort of, you know, a powerful identity. There's a guy called Michael Unger who does a lot of research on resilience, and he talks about risk-taking and responsibility seeking. That they're very, you know, very sort of closely connected. That young people are also looking for ways to take responsibility, to be in charge, and to have power, and to those sort of powerful identities. So, just to highly recommend checking him out. He's at the little reading list at the end, and it's a way of you know, sort of stepping into adolescence, not a kid anymore. So there's a whole bunch of really understandable and valuable potential outcomes, you know, on the roll of this dice. But what's on the line? What are you gambling with? So there's criminal issues. You know, there's going to jail, getting arrested, all of that court stuff. But again, how do we weight these things? So for this young person, they've always been a bad kid. They've always been naughty. You know, the idea of you know, having, you know, getting in trouble, the idea of, you know, going to court, the idea of being the sort of black sheep is not aversive in any way, because it's something that's part of their identity already. They've always been, you know, little Jeff who's disruptive and annoying and winding up the class, and, you know, gets kicked out, gets expelled. So again, that sort of history and those schemas and beliefs weigh or give a quality to, you know, to these sort of, give a value to what they're gambling with. You know, you could get hooked, could get addicted, but that's not going to happen to me. And for a lot of people in general, but a lot of young people, there's this sense that there's people out there who get addicted to drugs. They're muppets, they're rookies, they're amateurs. It won't happen to me. I'm switched on. I'm not a goose. I have control and agency, and I am in charge of my life. So it speaks to a specific perspective on drug use, sort of a more moral perspective, that there's a particular capacity or failing within a person that leads to addiction. And also thinking about family rejection, that's something you might be risking. Your family, families don't tend to be super stoked about adolescent methamphetamine use. But for this particular young person, they're in resi care. They've been there for about 4 years now. Their family have failed to protect. Their family haven't been, any sort of real support to them. They haven't been sort of really well connected. So family rejection is a non-issue for this person. So I think this is really important to weigh up with each individual young person, to look at the gamble they're willing to make. That this young person, connection to new social group, this young person has no other friends. This young person has no other social connections. And for those of you out there who love the work of Dan Siegel, to borrow that sort of essence of adolescence idea, the idea of social engagement being a matter of life or death for adolescents, that this young person will gamble a hell of a lot for this chance of connection, of belonging, of being part of the group, being part of the herd. So that's, if we were sort of looking at a blackjack, this is, I'm willing to, I'm betting everything I've got, the whole, putting all my chips on the table for this. That's a vital thing that I need. So again, looking at this as a specific, some specifics around adolescence that link into why these things are particularly profound. But I think this is really important to understand that from our perspective as adults, the idea of, sort of criminal issues and charges, like I have no criminal charges myself personally, and if I did, it would probably ruin my career. So for me, that is, I would not bet anything on that. That is a horrendous gamble, no matter what's on the other, $1 million, still pretty dumb gamble for me to make as a, a fully fledged adult, more or less. But for a young person, this is, to be able to get connection to peers, and like Dan Siegel says, it is a matter of life or death, or feels like a matter of life or death, belonging to that group. You're willing to gamble pretty much anything, especially when you don't have very much. Again, if you've only got $20 in the bank, going bankrupt is not a concerning proposition. If you're a millionaire, it's definitely going to hit you a lot harder. And this is, I guess, to flesh out this analogy, adults, they're the millionaires. You've got a lot in the bank, so why would you want to risk any of that? Young people, you're just starting out. So I think this is really important, I guess, to understand, what young people, the way they take risks tells us a lot about what they value, what they believe, what they care about, what is really important to them. So what are they trying to get? Is this about social connection? Is this about identity? Is this about individuation? Is this about, I guess, what's the need? What's the thing that they really care about, that they desperately want? And what are the things that they are willing to sacrifice for that? So does this, is this person willing to bet the farm on social connection? So it tells us they really, really deeply care about social connection, and they desperately need that. But they will forego, connection with their own family of origin. They will forego legal issues. They will forego a whole bunch of other things. So understanding what people value in relation to what they want, what they need, what their needs are, lets us, ideally when we're care planning for young people and trying to figure out how to develop a sort of treatment pathway, lets us know what we need to provide for them, right? So that young person, we need to provide social connection. We need to facilitate some way of that young person connecting with and finding belonging in a social context. And this young person is pretty freaking desperate for that. This young person doesn't have much in the way of family, doesn't have much in the way of concern about, so we're sort of bordering on some criminogenic attitudes there, don't particularly give much of a stuff about their sort of criminal outcomes. So this is really useful information, that sort of in the spirit of all behaviour is communication. This is really useful information we're getting from the young person about what they need and what they will trade for that. And I guess inversely what they won't trade. So if you're thinking about the one that stands out for me, I think I might have mentioned this in the previous webinar, is we've had a lot of young people when I was working in the East who steal cars. Love it, can't get enough of it. Pinching cars, driving around the countryside, and these young people will happily trade, connection to criminal issues, their family connection, families are pretty annoyed about this stuff, and a variety of other things for this. There's a reputation around stealing cars, which is really important for them, and there's a social connection, and there's a thrill and an excitement there. So that tells us that what we need to do with these young people, with people engaged in this stuff, is find ways of them having a powerful reputation for something other than stealing cars, to be seen socially and valued socially by their peers, and to be sort of held in esteem for a skill they have other than stealing cars and driving quickly. So one of the things that we look at is, for someone in that context, what else can we do? So is there another way you can take a risk, or try and sort of show someone, the thing that stands out for me is, could we work with that young person on helping them develop a rap that they've been writing for the last couple of months, get some beats behind it, and potentially they could present that or do that at the end of year at their alternative ed school. That's incredibly thrilling and exciting, and probably massively anxiety provoking. But if that lands, if that pays off, all their mates will think that it's amazing, and they're gangster. Oh, that was so sick, bros! I didn't know you could rap. That was mental. That was awesome. I loved it. So it's I guess understanding what they're trying to get out of the gamble of risk taking allows us to find other ways to sort of support that where possible. So in care planning for risk taking, we're looking at ways, as I just mentioned, ways to find, we know what the young person needs, we know what they're willing to gamble for, so we know what the outcomes they're trying to get, and we know what they do, what they care about, what they don't care about, and inversely what they do care about. So if we're looking at trying to, to explore other ways to meet those needs, it's really important that we know these young people. Just to give a quick nod to our friend Vygotsky, Lev Vygotsky, who talked about the zone of proximal development. Knowing a young person, having a therapeutic alliance and working a relationship with a young person lets us know whether, for example, you could support that young person to do the rap he'd been working on in front of the 10 kids in his alternative ed school. Is that something that is in the, yes, it's a challenge, but it's exciting zone? Is that an overwhelm zone? Or is that in the don't even care about it, way too easy zone? So knowing young people well, knowing their shape, knowing where their sort of challenge zones are is really key, so that we can make sure that these different alternative things we look at, we try and provide for them, are tailored. And going back to that sort of slide of the different dimensions of risk taking, because someone's taking a physical risk, that is there another way we can find another dimension of risk that's more manageable and less acutely dangerous, that we can sort of support a young person to take risks in and try and learn and grow and develop through, and again gain resources and assets through that, that is, I guess, more sustainable than potentially stolen cars, physical risk, you crash, you die. So that's a pretty major acute risk. How else do we find ways of people trying to get the thing they want out of that gamble, in a way that is maybe a chronic risk or a lower level risk, or a more sustainable sort of activity. So we've talked a lot about the benefits of promoting learning through risk, allowing young people to, or providing ways for young people to try things, develop skills, learn, and just quickly on that point, the more times you do a risk-taking activity, which is sensation-seeking, the more times you do an activity which is, reward-seeking, but also connected to your sort of cognitive processes, so not impulsive, the good kind of risk-taking, the more you learn and the more you connect the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex, the more that you have, there's a lot of, I think I mentioned in the previous webinar, that people go from a very structured, fixed, verbatim understanding of how to take risks to a more diffuse, gist-based understanding of how to take risks, in the way that adults take risks that are kind of the vibe of the thing, as opposed to let me work out the exact physics and statistics and probability of this thing and make a decision. So the more we support people to take risks, social, emotional, reputational, physical, the more we walk alongside that process, keeping in mind the sort of spirit of our friend Vygotsky, knowing someone's shape and being able to tailor that approach. The more we do that, when more we allow and support people to connect risk-taking and sensation-seeking and trying to achieve new things that are possibly dangerous, with thinking, with processing, with reflection, with really good decision-making in a way that once it becomes, once people get really, really good at it, really, really practiced at it, that becomes much more of a stable sort of heuristic process. I guess by way of example, I race mountain bikes with limited success, but I've been doing it for a lot of years. That's part of the stuff that I do in adventure-based therapy. And for me, I can ride pretty much any trail anywhere and have a vibe of whether I can hit a jump, whether I can do a drop, without measuring it, without sort of walking it out, without checking the wind speed, because I've done it so many times that sort of, sort of the drive to take that risk or take that chance is so well connected to, the processing and learning and development and assessment and review of that behaviour that it's almost an unconscious process. So we want to provide ways for young people to do this with their risk-taking as they move into adulthood. If we deny them this, then they don't learn how to take risks in meaningful ways, and you have to go with the very verbatim, measuring, testing, assessing, doing the calculations, testing the wind speed stuff. And that really cognitive verbatim style of risk assessment is really vulnerable to emotional states. So if you're having a crappy day, or you're having a stressful day, or you're having an exciting, amazing day, that can dramatically change how you assess or how you make decisions around risk. Whereas once that risk stuff has become really well practiced, really well integrated, and again to that sort of verbatim, that gist-based vibe of the thing, understanding of risk-taking, that is really stable, predictable, and doesn't tend to, like I could be having a really rubbish day or a really great day, I can still pick the speed I need to hit a jump at, if that makes sense. It's not really impacted so much by a bunch of other sort of variables which are problematic. So getting back to the other part of the job for us here is looking at how we work with impulsivity, because if you're working with young people in the AOD context, we can probably assume that there's a bit going on for them, and that there's probably been some challenges early on. Maybe there's been a lack of skill building around things like impulsivity, emotional regulation, distress tolerance, that sort of stuff. So whilst we're finding opportunities to understand the gamble of risk for young people and provide other ways for them to meet those needs and get those resources and to get the learning and to experience the learning that's contained within that, we also need to be looking at how we improve impulsivity. And there's a guy, Lawrence Steinberg, who I note in the end of this as well, who talks about impulsivity being the one most important thing to work on. When people have poor impulse control, it tends to have impacts across various domains of their life. It tends to be very, very damaging. So things like quitting a job because you hate it before you find another job. Things like having unprotected sex. Things like someone's just pulled out some mystery white powder at a party. I'm going to rack a couple of lines of this up. Those sort of impulsive actions can be really, really problematic and really, really damaging. So if we can figure out ways to improve people's impulsivity, then we're going to have a double benefit here. So we're going to have a benefit on on risk taking, on mind, I guess the risk taking which doesn't entail learning, and the things that improve impulse control are things that are typically things that work on working memory. So working memory is that thing where you can keep one thing in mind while you think about the immediate reward. So for example, I would love to eat this cheesy snack. If I eat cheesy snacks all the time, I am going to be incredibly unfit and out of shape for the race season. Just a quick little insight into my life. I struggle every day with not eating cheesy snacks. But this is an important thing, that sort of working memory, to be able to hold in mind the thing you want, or the thing that's important to you, while you're presented with an opportunity for something immediate. So there's some processes that improve that. There's NBAC tasks, so Google them. There's NBAC tasks, there's apps that show you how these work. Basically, it's about trying to remember a number or a shape or a color that's in a series of colors or shapes that are a few numbers back. So when the music stops, you're like, what was 2 or 3 back? So it's just basically strengthening your exercise in that part of your mind. Micro-mindfulness, this is less about the sort of full-blown meditative yoga-esque mindfulness stuff, and more about just having a bit more control over your attention, where your focus goes. So they're sort of more, mindful leans, mindful walking, those sort of things where you're choosing where your attention is, rather than your attention, getting sort of swept down the stream with the shiny thing that presents itself. Distress tolerance is really useful, so building people's distress tolerance. The greater your distress tolerance is, the less likely you're going to pursue an immediate reward that alleviates your distress. Problem-solving, decision-making skills, all of this stuff is basically push-ups for your prefrontal cortex. This is push-ups and exercise to build the capacity and skill, the capacity and strength of the parts of your brain that are responsible for impulse control. And the beautiful thing about adolescents is they're really, really good at, they build muscles really quickly in this context. The adolescents are really dynamic and malleable and plastic in their brains, so they learn new things really quickly and really well. So this is really important to do. And also, if young people are out there taking risks, whether it's doing a rap in front of their alternative ed school, an example that came out of a conversation yesterday was one of my colleagues supports young women to do graph projects around the north and west suburbs, legal obviously, of Melbourne. That's a massive risk that someone's taking to put their art out there, to put their creativity out there on display for all to see. That's a huge risk that they're taking. And that risk is being supported by and walked alongside by and helped made sense of by this worker who is, that is checking with the young person before they put that stuff up there, making sure that they're feeling comfortable with it, making sure that they're, that they're aware of what that will, how they might feel once that's up there, and people, if someone says anything negative about it, how that whole process works. This worker is lending and coaching, lending the part of the brain that's really effective at thinking that through, but also coaching and skill building for that young person to be able to say, well, here's a risk I'm about to take. Now let's do the cognitive work around that. Help me make good assessments around that. What's the possible consequences? So walking young people through those processes, walking young people through the learning and the assessment and review processes around risk taking is again a skill building process. It's more push-ups. Oh, so there's one more thing I wanted to mention about this before we get to the links is we do a whole bunch of stuff at YSAS about resilience-based care planning or resilience-based work. Resilience-based approaches to youth, drug and alcohol essentially look at unmet needs. So drug and alcohol use is a behaviour that meets a need for people, it performs a function, and our job therefore is to figure out how else we can meet those needs and perform those functions, which is kind of congruent with what we've been talking about today. So if you're into resilience-based practice or would like to know more about it, would love to share that with you. But also what we're talking about today, understanding the gamble of adolescent risk-taking fits in very well and very neatly with the understandings of resilience. And resilience is also not just about making sure young people have access to and are connected to resources, internal and external, in their lives that they can thrive through, but also letting young people have challenges, having adversity, taking risks, because the idea with resilience is you can have all of the self-esteem, problem-solving, connection, support, housing, money, all of those resources that make people resilient in the world. You can have every single one of them, but until they're tested, you don't know how to use them. So it's like having all of the tools, all the power tools in the world at home, and until the roof starts leaking, you have to get out there and pull the tin off and fix it and actually do it and operationalize it. They're useless. So risk allows us to operationalize and to learn how to use these resources and assets we have as well. Again, thinking about how we make assessments, thinking about how we ask other people for support when we're taking risks, thinking about how we apologize and make amends for when things have gone pear-shaped. There's a whole other discussion around resilience here, but hopefully that's made a bit of sense. And just finishing off on some of these links and resources, there's a lot of things I'd like to talk about. We have limited time. If anyone would like to continue this conversation, hit me up at the email noted there. There's some really great stuff on our Youth AD Toolbox, and there's a really great article, really current article, which is the second one listed there. Really definitely worth checking out. And there's plenty of other people who have great insights into adolescent risk-taking, the list down the bottom. But yeah, should we
Quick QA?
Yeah, let's do some questions. Anyone got any thoughts or reflections?
Okay, so not sure if I'm audio though. Yeah, so thanks so much for that, Jeff. That was amazing. So I mean, I really am taking away so many things, but I love the whole entrepreneurial kind of slant. That makes a lot of sense, actually. It's a really cool lens to kind of look, to be able to see this issue about how do we really work effectively with young people. And, just understanding, just trying to make sure we understand what what they're trying to get out of taking risks, their risk-taking behaviour. I think that was, that's a big takeaway for me, so thank you for that. Jeff is now available to take questions, so if you've got some questions you wanted to pop in the chat box. I know we've gone over a little bit over the time that we're meant to end the webinar, but we did start late, so we have got a little bit of time for you to ask your questions. And so you can go ahead and type those, or if you've got any comments or feedback at this stage for us or for Jeff, you can go ahead and type those in the chat box. And as Jeff said, if you're watching this if you don't have time now, or if you are actually watching this as the replay, Jeff's put his email address there, so feel free to email him with any questions or feedback that you want to give him.
Yep, and like I say, if you email me and want to have a chat, text is fun, but I'd love to have a chat, have a coffee with anyone who wants to discuss the stuff, work in the youth space, wants to more meaningfully and usefully incorporate understandings of risks or sort of risk-positive approaches. It's obviously something that I'm really into in my adventure-based stuff, but there's a ton of benefits in here, so yeah, please let us know.
Cool. So we've got a question that's come from Stacey. So Stacey says, when you mentioned that risk was gendered and males steal cars, etc., what examples could you give when discussing females and their internalizing behaviours?
So I guess that was a generalisation. Obviously, I've had plenty of female clients I've worked with that are damn good at stealing cars, and plenty of male clients that externalise a lot of their behaviours. But I guess when we're thinking about some of the risks that females might take, things like social risks, things like moving into new social groups, things like trying out a more sort of different or diverse or individual identity than is the norm of a group. So I am going to get an eyebrow ring and wear a different kind of thing to to what the norm is for the rest of my cohort. That's something that's, I guess that's a pretty massive risk that we tend to see, that, I guess in my experience, see much more of that amongst young women. So those, I guess people sort of, young women maybe reinventing, trying new things in social groups, relational risk-taking. So, having relationships with males or females, whoever it might be, but where there's, potential risk for reputation, whether there's potential risk for other relationships that you might have had a background of, of attachment issues and early life attachment trauma, that's engaging in relationships, trying new things, connecting with workers, connecting with peers, that's a pretty massive risk to take those kind of, to let people into your life, to be seen, to be vulnerable. And I guess in my experience, that seems to be something that young women are much more, much more engaged in. Just thinking about some of the adventure-based stuff I've done where, we'd be 4 or 5 days paddling down a river, having a debrief over a campfire, and some of the sort of emotional vulnerability that is shown by, the emotional risk that is shown by the women on these programs in sharing what's going on for them and their experiences and their histories. That I've seen that much less with young men, if that makes sense.
Thank you. We've got a comment here that you might want to respond to, Jeff, as well. Ian saying, I've found that there's nothing more compelling to a young person than accepting that they will be an adult too. Attaining future prospects is the main struggle for acceptance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. There's there's a sort of a paternalistic power differential thing that exists here, where you silly, impertinent, young people just doing these sort of taking these silly risks that at some point, this is the point of all of it. The point of all of their behaviour is to prepare to be adults, to get into this space, to have the skills and abilities and resources and assets that we take for granted. I think that's and it also doesn't lock them in a point in time. It puts them in a chronological context. It puts them in a developmental context. But they are on the path to becoming adults. It's a process for them. It's not just you are a 16-year-old, you can't make good decisions, you're a little muppet. I think that's really important. Accepting that they will be an adult too. That's where they're heading. We need to equip them for that. It's not a passive process. We don't just wait for them to do that. it's our job to empower them and to create the circumstances to allow them to do that effectively and strongly.
We've got Dr. J is also asking a question. What's the suicide or death rate amongst risk-taking adults?
Adolescents. So in terms of impulsivity versus risk-sensitive young people, risk-sensitive young people tend to have really positive outcomes. There's not massive, because they learn very quickly. Again, when you're co-opting your cortical processes into that sort of limbic risk-taking activity, people learn really quickly, and they get really, young people learn much quickly from adverse outcomes than adults do. So amongst that cohort, really good outcomes, really beneficial. But amongst people who are really impulsive and who act without thinking, it's much more problematic. There is an increase about a 200%, this is American stats, just trying to remember off the top of my head, about a 200% increase through adolescence in death and serious injury for adolescents as opposed to children and adults. So there's a blip, like an increase in mortality and major adverse outcomes. So I guess this is the sort of understand what are the things that we need to support young people to take risks around it and provide some more useful, more safe, more meaningful opportunities, and what are some of the things that we need to absolutely just put the brakes on. And Lawrence Steinberg, there's some critiques of his approach to that sort of imbalanced model of adolescent development, but what he talks about is things like the graduated P program. So how you can't have passengers in the car when you're on your Ps because they rev you up and you're more likely to take those risks in the context of, so just not letting you have passengers when you're on your Ps. That's that's a very sort of structural intervention. Or he talks about not having bottle shops near high schools. It's a structural intervention. It takes it out of the realm of us trying to provide opportunities for learning. It says actually some of these things are just too big of a risk. We need to kind of put a fence around that. If that makes sense. But it's in I think if you check out the second article, I think there's some rates, again American rates, but it's increases in mortality, and there's some stuff in the Monitoring the Future study out of the States as well.
Beautiful. So yeah, just to remind everybody, those research papers are in the folder. You can download those, or they are on the slides where Jeff's provided those links. Thanks so much, Jeff. Jeff, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your, we've also got somebody saying to promote something. Please promote FAPMI program for families where there are mental health issues. FAPMI.
Yep.
Yep. So bit of a shout out to.
Big shout out to FAPMI.
Yeah. Thank you. So I wanted to thank you so much because, you've got a really, really busy schedule, and we really, really value your time and your experience and your knowledge. Thanks so much, Jeff, for coming and sharing that with us. And also a big thank you to everybody who's turned up live today, who's, been present for this and who's asked questions. We know that makes it, a more engaging webinar for everybody, and, it's great just to get that information out there. So somebody's also just asking, can I be emailed a list of the webinars? So I'm just going to let you know the next one that's coming up, but also if you subscribe to VADA, the e-newsletter, you're always going to be made aware of the next webinars, but you can also subscribe to the Turning Point website. So if you go to turningpoint.org.au, and actually the next webinar is on the homepage, so you'll be able to register for that one now, and so we'll always have those on our website. You'll also always see them promoted through VADA, so they'll come into your inbox as we've got the links up live. So the next one is on Thursday the 21st of March. It's another 1 p.m, so from 1 till 2 p.m. And this one is called The Brain Disease Model of Addiction and Implications for Practice. It's being presented by Tony Barnett, who is a part of the Turning Point Research and Development team. He's a qualitative researcher, and he is doing his PhD on this topic at the moment. So he is going to join us, and you can ask him questions about that. So his thesis is exploring Australian drug and alcohol treatment providers' views about the brain disease model of addiction and how neuroscientific models integrate with practice. So his webinar is going to aim to synthesize and translate the new research that's examined a broad range of AOD treatment providers' views and also the clinical impacts from there. So tune into that one. Do register for that, and again, you'll be able to download and take away some of his research as well. And so please do that. So I'll just pop that. Also, please don't forget, we're going to, once we log out, Redback are going to pop a survey up, and this is really important for us to just gain a bit of information about, what's working, what's not working, and also if you've got ideas for information, specialized knowledge or skills, or if there's just somebody that you think would make a great presentation, or somebody whose work that you really admire or value, make sure to feed that back to us, and we'll try and get in contact with people who you'd like to see do webinars as well. So give us some ideas. We really want to make sure that these are really, really relevant and really valuable for everybody. So please stay tuned for when we log off of here, and Redback will make that exit survey live for you to have a go. And there is a picture of Tony, who you'll see next month on the 21st of March. So, and there's the turning point, the URLs down the bottom there. You'll find at that URL, you'll find all of Turning Point's webinars, but also you'll find all of our workshops and education sessions. So please go on and register. And thanks so much for being with us today. We will see you next time.